everybody and welcome back to my channel. In today's video I'm going to be talking through everything you need to know about watercolours, so from the paper to the brushes to the paints you need to use and just all the information you need to get started. Just quickly, if you are new to my channel, I'm Amy and I create videos here every single week, so make sure that you do subscribe to my channel and hit the bell to make sure that you get notified every time I upload a video. Without further ado, let's jump right into today's video. So I get it, some of you might be really new to watercolour, perhaps you haven't even started using watercolour, but you want to get a head start and make sure that you are buying all the correct items you need. So let's start with the biggest thing, and that is the paints. So which paints should you buy and which shouldn't you buy? There are just so many options to choose from, and I was really stuck with which watercolour sets to buy as well. So I'll talk through a few good options to get you started, and these watercolour sets are really good for beginners, but I also use them as well. So you don't want to be investing in really cheap sets. I get that it might be tempting to just buy a really cheap set if you're trying to save money, but sometimes it is better to buy a slightly more expensive brand, especially when it comes to watercolour paints. So cheap watercolour sets that I don't recommend are any sets that are really meant for children, so any watercolour sets that you would find in the children's section of a store, and also pound shops, dollar stores. A lot of sets that are under about $20 or pounds are often not very good as well. There's a lot of misconceptions that you cannot create really nice watercolour paintings from student grade sets, and that is not true. So I actually use a watercolour set that is technically a student grade set, and I use these watercolours for all of my paintings. I personally use the Cotman watercolour set by Winsor and Newton, and these only cost me £30, so that's not too bad, especially when you consider that there are a lot of really expensive watercolour sets. So some watercolour sets that I do recommend you look at are the Cotman watercolour set by Winsor and Newton that I have, and also there are some other good sets perfect for beginners and even professionals. Those ones are the Arteza watercolours, the Van Gogh half pan set, and the Schmink Academy as well. So just in my personal opinion, I really don't think it is essential to use watercolour paints that are really expensive unless you are creating paintings that you're selling to clients and you want to use that really high quality paint for its vibrancy and colour pigment and resistance. If you are just getting started though and you are a beginner and just want to create paintings for fun, then any of those student grade, mid-grade paint sets are really worth looking into and investing in. Now, the next thing that you would definitely want to get right is the type of paper you are using with watercolours. You don't want to be using the wrong type of paper because you will have all sorts of problems. So you don't want to be using a really thin paper because all that is going to happen is that as soon as you start to get the paper wet, the water can soak through and rip the paper. Also, if your paper is too thin and it can't absorb water, it's more likely to warp as it starts to dry. You want to make sure that you are using thicker paper that can be taped back and can return to a flat state once it's dry. So you always want to make sure that you are using watercolour paper. I don't recommend that you use paper for watercolour pieces if it is less than £140 or 300 GSM squared. So when you are buying watercolour paper, make sure it is at least £140 or 300 GSM squared. That just basically means its paper thickness and weight. So you know that you want to be using a watercolour paper, but again we have the same problem as with the paints, and that is there's just so many options to choose from and it's really difficult to know which paper you should buy. So again, I've got some really good options for you, and I've listed the paper in the description box down below as well if you want to check any of the materials I'm mentioning out. So my favourite brand for watercolour paper has to be Arches. Arches is my favourite brand of watercolour paper because I really like the paper texture and thickness. Arches sells watercolour paper in both hot pressed and cold pressed versions. Hot pressed is smoother and cold press is a rougher texture. I personally like their cold press paper because I prefer painting on a rougher surface, but you may prefer a smooth surface, and in which case I really recommend buying the hot press paper from Arches. Another brand I really love using is the Fabriano aquarello paper. Again, there's lots of different variations of paper, both in hot pressed and cold pressed paper, and lots of different sized paper as well. And the really good thing about these brands is that they aren't that expensive either, so it cost me about £25 to £35 for the paper, but it's really good quality and paper I recommend to anyone that wants to start using watercolours. So let's move on to the paintbrushes, and again, when I first started using watercolours, I really didn't know where to start when I was looking at buying paintbrushes. So again, there are just so many different options and paintbrushes out there. There's cheap ones, expensive ones, individual ones, paintbrush sets, and it can be a lot to take in when you're a beginner. So let me talk through some paintbrushes I use and I recommend. Firstly, I don't recommend again buying really cheap paintbrushes, so any paintbrushes that you would find in kids sections in the art and craft departments, and I definitely don't recommend you buy brushes from really cheap stores like the Dollar Store. In the UK we have Poundland. Don't buy them from there because they're not designed for professional use. Do have a look online for paintbrushes and definitely have a look into these brushes that I have used and I love using and recommend. Daler Rowney is a fantastic company for paintbrushes. I use their paintbrushes all the time in my watercolour paintings and I just love them. I recommend the Daler Rowney Aquafine paintbrushes, and you can get those from Amazon and they are really cheap on there. And also I recommend the Daler Rowney Sable Rounded Brush Head paintbrushes, again all available on Amazon. They are affordable and good quality as well. If you want to step it up a notch and buy a really high quality paintbrush set, then I know a lot of artists love using the Silver Brush Black Velvet paintbrushes, and apparently these are some of the best paintbrushes on the market. I haven't actually tried these yet, but they are quite expensive, so I guess I'll just have to save up a bit and try these out for myself another time. And you can also buy those paintbrushes from Amazon as well. So now we are just moving on to the actual painting process now. So we talked about all the essentials for the paints, paper and brushes, but what about the actual painting process? What things do I think you should avoid and what things should you do when you are painting with watercolours? Well, the first thing you shouldn't do is just start painting without first taping down your paper. If you don't tape down your paper first before you start painting, then your paper will just warp and you won't be able to stretch it back out again. If you tape down your paper first before you start painting, then you actually straighten and stretch the paper out and you hold it into place. I personally use the clear magic scotch tape to tape down my paper, and I bought this from Amazon. I think it was about £5, and that is for a 3-meter roll. I like using this tape because it is clear, and obviously I film my drawing and painting processes, so I don't like using masking tape. But masking tape will work just as well, just be careful that you don't rip the paper when you remove that tape. Another tip I have before you start the painting process is actually about your sketch outlines. So if you have drawn a sketch from a reference photo onto the paper first, then a top tip I have is to make sure that your outlines are nice and light so that you don't get pencil lines showing through the painting. I use graphite pencils to sketch out my outline, but I sketch really lightly, and I mean you can hardly see the outlines. And if I've sketched anything a bit too dark, I just use a kneaded eraser to lift some of the pencil back off the paper. You can also use watercolour pencils for your outlines, and watercolour pencils are great because as soon as you mix them in with watercolours, they will just fade away and you won't get any lines. A common beginner mistake with watercolours is that people don't have the right water control, so I see quite a lot of beginners are not using the correct amount of water. If you're not using enough water, then it's going to be really hard to achieve certain effects and techniques, so the paper will be really dry and the watercolours need water in order to travel, so watercolour will only go where there is water. If you also apply too much water to the paper, then this can cause puddles, and as the paper starts to expand, water can collect in one area forming those puddles, and it can cause a real mess, and you have to try and get the water off the paper. Too much water can also rip the paper as well, so you definitely don't want to do that. You want to avoid using too much water. This next tip actually seems really simple, but trust me, this is something that a lot of people have problems with, and just this one thing can actually ruin your watercolour pieces. Trust me, this has happened to me a lot of times because I'm not the best person for being patient. So of course we are talking about waiting times. A lot of beginners, when they first start using watercolours, don't really know what to expect from them. I know when I first started using them, I actually panicked quite a lot because I was worried that the paint would dry really quick, so I would rush paintings. And this is one of the worst things to do, so definitely don't rush your paintings. You need to make sure that you are allowing a lot of time when you paint, and actually sometimes you might be waiting more for the paint to dry than you are actually painting, and that is just the way things go with watercolours. If you're trying to build up a lot of layers or colours and even textures, it's really essential that you wait for all your different layers to dry properly, because if you continue with adding more paint onto the paper, if you aren't being patient and waiting for the paper to dry, then it can create some horrible effects in your paintings. Anyway, that finishes off today's in-depth guide to using watercolours. I really hope you found this video useful, especially if you are new to watercolours and you don't really know where to start and what to do. If you are new to my channel, then don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn the bell on to be notified of all my future uploads. I upload art videos each week, so I'd love to have you on board and being a part of my channel. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you all in my next video. Bye!